The police officer's hand tightened on his gun as he barked, "Get on the ground now." The black man, wearing a plain hoodie and jeans, raised his hand slowly, a calm expression on his face. "Officer," he began, the cop cut him off. "I said get on the ground." The man hesitated for a moment. "I think you might want to rethink this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't care what you think." The officer shoved him roughly against the hood of the police car, yanking his arms back with unnecessary force. He snapped the handcuffs on and leaned in close. "You people don't belong in this neighborhood." That was when another car, sleek and black, screeched to a halt behind the cruiser. 4 men in suits jumped out, badges flashing under the streetlights. One of them spoke sharply. "Detective Carter, what the hell do you think you're doing? That man is an undercover FBI agent." The color drained from the officer's face. "What?" he stammered, his grip on the man's arm loosening. "You heard me," the suited man barked. "You just assaulted a federal agent." The black man turned his head slightly, a small, knowing smile on his face. "I tried to warn you." The officer stumbled back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I didn't know. He didn't tell me." "Tell it to Internal Affairs," another agent said coldly. The air around them felt electric, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. How did it come to this? It all started earlier that evening. Jamal Evans parked his car in the driveway of a modest house on the edge of a suburban neighborhood. He had spent months building his cover in this area for an ongoing investigation into a human trafficking ring. As an undercover FBI agent, he was used to blending in, but he also knew the risks of being a black man in an area like this. Jamal stepped out of his car, a grocery bag in one hand, and scanned the quiet street. It was mostly empty, save for a few porch lights glowing and a couple walking their dog at the end of the block. He liked to keep a low profile, and so far the assignment had gone smoothly. Inside the house, Jamal placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and checked his phone. There was a message from his handler, Agent White. "Possible meeting location identified. Stand by for confirmation." He exhaled deeply. The case was heating up, and the pressure was on. The trafficking ring had eluded law enforcement for years, but the FBI was finally closing in. Jamal had been placed undercover as a warehouse worker to gain access to their operations. As he waited for further instructions, Jamal decided to take a walk to clear his head. The cool evening air was refreshing, and the neighborhood was quiet. It was one of the things he had enjoyed about this cover, until that night. Halfway down the block, a police cruiser rolled past him. He didn't think much of it at first, but then the car slowed and stopped. Jamal felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, stepped out. His badge glinted under the streetlight as he called out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Jamal stopped and turned, keeping his hands visible. "Just taking a walk." "This is a private neighborhood," the officer said, his tone sharp. "You live around here?" Jamal nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm staying at 214 Maple Street." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Let me see some ID." Jamal hesitated. His cover required him to use an alias, and his ID matched that alias. But he also knew he hadn't done anything wrong. "I don't have my wallet on me," he said calmly. The officer stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "You think you can just walk around here without proving who you are?" "I'm not breaking any laws," Jamal replied, his voice steady but firm. The officer's hand tightened on the gun. "Don't get smart with me. Hands where I can see them." Jamal raised his hands, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He knew the drill. Compliance was his safest option, even if it stung his pride. "What's your name?" the officer demanded. "James Harris," Jamal said, giving the name from his cover. The officer's radio crackled, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes scanning Jamal's face with barely concealed disdain. "I know your type. Probably casing the neighborhood, looking for houses to break into." Jamal took a deep breath. "Officer, I'm just walking. If you want to check 214 Maple Street, you'll find my name on the lease." The officer sneered. "You think I'm stupid?" Before Jamal could respond, the officer grabbed his arm and spun him around, slamming him against the hood of the cruiser. The grocery bag he was carrying fell to the ground, oranges rolling into the street. "Hands behind your back," the officer barked. Jamal's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I think you're making a mistake," he said as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "Shut up," the officer snapped. That was when the black car arrived, its tires screeching against the pavement. The FBI agent stepped out of the car with a sense of authority that made the air feel heavier. The lead agent, a sharp-featured man named Agent White, fixed his icy stare on Detective Carter, who was still holding Jamal by the arm. "Detective Carter," Agent White said, his voice calm but laced with steel, "release him immediately." Carter hesitated, his face pale. "What's going on here?" "What's going on," Agent White said, stepping closer, "is that you just violated the rights of a federal agent who is working undercover in an active investigation. And you just jeopardized months of work." The officer's jaw dropped as he turned to look at Jamal, who was now standing tall and calm despite the tension crackling around him. "He's FBI." Carter stammered. "Yes," Agent White snapped. "And if you had bothered to ask any real questions instead of jumping to conclusions, you might have avoided this mess." Carter released Jamal's arm, stumbling back as if he'd been burned. I didn't know." He didn't say anything. Jamal, still wearing his calm demeanor, rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had dug in. "I tried to tell you," he said evenly, "but you weren't exactly listening." Another agent, a woman with curly hair and a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward. "We'll need your badge number, Detective. There's going to be an internal review." Carter's face reddened. "Come on, this is a misunderstanding. I thought he was—" "What?" Agent White cut him off. "Suspicious? Because he was walking in a neighborhood like this." The silence that followed was deafening. Carter looked down, mumbling something incoherent. Agent White sighed and turned to Jamal. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jamal replied. "But this could have gone a lot worse." "It shouldn't have happened at all," Agent White said. He turned back to Carter. "You're done for tonight. Go back to your precinct and wait for further instructions." Carter opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Agent White's face made him think better of it. He climbed into his cruiser and drove off, his taillights disappearing into the night. The agents regrouped, forming a tight circle around Jamal. "We're pulling you out of here," Agent White said. Jamal shook his head. "We're too close to blow it now. The meeting's still on for tonight, isn't it?" Agent White frowned. "Jamal, you were just made by local law enforcement. It's not safe." "I can handle it," Jamal insisted. "If I back out now, they'll know something's up. We've worked too hard to get this far." The female agent, Agent Collins, nodded. "He's right. If we pull him, the whole operation could collapse. But we need to keep a closer watch on him." Agent White hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but you stay wired the whole time. One wrong move and we pull you. No arguments." "Understood," Jamal said. Later that night, Jamal sat in his car outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building loomed dark and foreboding, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. This was the meeting place, the heart of the operation he had been working to infiltrate. His pulse quickened as he watched the shadows move inside the warehouse. The traffickers were here. He adjusted the tiny earpiece hidden in his ear, ensuring he could hear Agent White and the team. "We've got eyes on you." Agent White's voice crackled softly. "Copy that," Jamal whispered. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the warehouse, his every sense on high alert. The air smelled of oil and rust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from inside. As he entered, a tall man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek approached him. "You're late," the man growled. "Had a little run-in with the locals," Jamal replied smoothly. The man's eyes narrowed. Cops? Jamal shrugged. Handled it. The man stared at him for a moment longer, then nodded. Good, follow me. Jamal followed him deeper into the warehouse, where a group of men and women were gathered around a table piled with documents and cash. The tension in the room was palpable. The leader, a wiry man with piercing blue eyes, looked up as Jamal approached. You've got guts showing up here after that stunt last week, he said. Had to keep things interesting, Jamal replied, forcing a smirk. The leader chuckled, but the sound was cold. You'd better hope you're worth the risk. We've got a lot riding on the shipment. Jamal nodded, his mind racing. He needed to gather as much information as possible without blowing his cover. Suddenly, the leader's phone rang. He answered it, his expression darkening. What do you mean, there's a problem? The room fell silent as he listened to the caller, his knuckles whitening around the phone. When he hung up, he turned to the group, his eyes blazing. We've got a rat. The word sent a jolt through Jamal's chest. The leader's gaze swept over the group, landing on Jamal. You've been asking too many questions. Jamal kept his face neutral, but his heart was pounding. I'm just trying to do my job. Yeah, the leader sneered. Well, maybe your job is working for someone else. He pulled a gun from his waistband and aimed it at Jamal. Who the hell are you? The leader demanded. Jamal stared down the barrel of the gun, his mind racing. This could be it. The room was dead silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Jamal could feel the sweat trickling down his back as the leader's finger hovered near the trigger. Answer me, the leader barked, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls. Jamal held his ground, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. I've been loyal since day one. If I wanted to turn on you, you think I'd still be standing here? The leader's eyes narrowed, but his hand didn't waver. The other men and women in the room were on edge, their hands drifting toward their own weapons. The man with the scar, the one who had led Jamal inside, stepped forward. Boss, let's think this through. If he's the rat, where's the proof? The leader didn't lower the gun, but he hesitated. You want proof? How about the fact that the cops have been circling us like vultures for weeks now? Someone's been feeding them intel, and I want to know who. Then check me, Jamal said, his voice steady. Search me, search my car, search my place. You won't find a damn thing because I'm not your rat. The leader's piercing eyes bore into Jamal, as if trying to read his soul. Finally, he lowered the gun, but his expression remained cold. Search him, he ordered, nodding toward the man with the scar. Jamal didn't flinch as the man patted him down, his hands rough but methodical. He knew the wire he was wearing was undetectable. It was disguised as a small scar behind his ear. The FBI had spared no expense to ensure his cover was airtight. He's clean, the man with the scar said after a moment. The leader grunted, clearly unsatisfied but unable to argue. Fine, but if I catch even a whiff of betrayal, you're dead. Got it? Crystal clear, Jamal replied. The leader waved him off, and the group returned to their discussion, though the tension in the room lingered like a bad smell. Jamal took a seat near the edge of the group, his mind racing. The FBI team in his ear was silent, likely assessing the situation and deciding their next move. He knew he had narrowly escaped disaster, but the night was far from over. The leader began outlining plans for the next shipment, his voice low and serious. Jamal listened intently, mentally recording every detail. This was the break the FBI needed, the confirmation of the trafficking ring's operations, and their next move. Suddenly, the leader's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. I'll be right back, he muttered, stepping away to take the call. Jamal used the opportunity to glance at the documents on the table. They were a mix of shipping manifests, payment records, and coded messages. He focused on a particular page that seemed to outline the routes for the next shipment. Careful, a voice said behind him. Jamal turned to see the man with the scar watching him. Just trying to stay informed, Jamal said casually. The man smirked. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But the boss doesn't trust easily. You'd better watch yourself. Jamal nodded, keeping his expression neutral. I'll keep that in mind. As the night wore on, the meeting finally began to wind down. The group dispersed and Jamal made his way back to his car. He slid into the driver's seat, exhaling deeply as the adrenaline began to wear off. Did you get everything? Agent White's voice crackled in his ear. Yeah, Jamal replied. They're planning a shipment next Friday. I saw the route and the drop-off points. We've got them. Good work, Agent White said. Get back to base. We'll debrief and start planning the takedown. Jamal nodded, starting the car and pulling away from the warehouse. But as he drove through the dark, empty streets, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it, but as he turned onto a quieter street, the car behind him followed. Jamal's grip tightened on the wheel. I think I'm being followed, he said quietly. Stay calm, Agent White said. Can you confirm? Jamal made another turn, this time onto a side street. The car behind him did the same. Yeah, it's confirmed, he said, his voice steady but tense. Do not engage, Agent White instructed. We're dispatching backup to your location. Just keep driving and stay on the line. Jamal's heart raced as he navigated the streets, trying to shake his tail without raising suspicion. The other car stayed close, its presence like a shadow he couldn't escape. Then, just as he thought he might lose them, the car behind him accelerated, slamming into his bumper. Jamal's car lurched forward and he fought to keep control. They just hit me, he said into the mic. Hang tight, Agent White said. Backup is 2 minutes out. The pursuing car rammed him again, this time harder. Jamal's car swerved, the tires screeching as he narrowly avoided hitting a parked vehicle. The driver of the other car pulled alongside him, and Jamal caught a glimpse of the man's face, a cold, determined expression that sent a chill down his spine. The man raised a gun, pointing it directly at Jamal. The muzzle of the gun flashed, and a deafening crack shattered the night. Jamal instinctively ducked, the bullet smashing through his passenger side window, scattering glass across the seats. His heart pounded as he yanked the wheel hard, swerving to avoid another shot. Shots fired. Jamal shouted into the mic. They're shooting at me. Agent White's voice came through, sharp and urgent. Hold on, Jamal. Backup is less than a minute out. Do not stop the car. Jamal gritted his teeth, forcing his foot down on the gas. The engine roared as he sped through the quiet streets, his mind racing for options. The shooter's car stayed on his tail, its headlights glaring like twin suns in his rearview mirror. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the back of Jamal's car. The impact sent a jolt through the vehicle, but he managed to keep control. He had to think fast. He spotted an intersection up ahead, the traffic lights blinking yellow. Without hesitation, Jamal yanked the wheel hard to the right, skidding onto a side street. The tires squealed in protest, but the maneuver bought him a few precious seconds of distance. The shooter's car followed, tires screeching as it rounded the corner. Jamal, take the next left, Agent White instructed. Backup is converging on your position. Jamal followed the directions, cutting through a narrow alley that barely fit his car. The shooter's vehicle scraped against the brick walls as it tried to follow, but it didn't slow down. Ahead, Jamal saw the flashing lights of unmarked vehicles barreling toward him. Relief flooded his chest as the FBI team arrived, their cars forming a blockade at the alley's exit. The shooter's car slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just feet from the agents. Doors flew open as armed FBI agents poured out, their weapons trained on the vehicle. Step out of the car. Hands where we can see them. One of the agents barked. The driver hesitated, then threw the door open. He stepped out slowly, his hands raised, the gun still visible in his grip. Drop the weapon. The man smirked but complied, letting the gun fall to the ground with a metallic clatter. Jamal pulled his car to a stop behind the blockade, his hands trembling slightly as he turned off the engine. He stayed in the vehicle, catching his breath as the FBI agents swarmed the shooter, pinning him to the ground and securing him in cuffs. Agent White appeared at Jamal's door, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Jamal nodded, exhaling deeply. "I'm good. Just a little shaken." "Get out of the car," White said, opening the door. "We need to get you checked out and debriefed." Jamal stepped out, his legs feeling slightly unsteady. As he glanced back at his car, the shattered window and bullet holes were stark reminders of how close he'd come to disaster. Back at the safe house, Jamal sat at the table with a cup of coffee in his hands. Agent Collins was patching up a small cut on his arm from the broken glass, her touch gentle but efficient. "You were lucky out there," she said. Jamal nodded. "Luck doesn't usually hold up in this line of work." White entered the room, the grim look on his face. "We've identified the shooter. He's one of the ring's enforcers, likely sent to tie up loose ends." "They know," Jamal said, his voice flat. White nodded. "It's possible. We think the leader got spooked after that phone call at the warehouse. They might suspect you, but don't have solid proof yet." Jamal leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "So what now?" "We're accelerating the takedown," White said. "The shipment is still set for Friday, but we're moving in before then. If they think you're compromised, they'll try to cut and run. We can't let that happen." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I need to stay in the field." "No way," White said firmly. "You've already been targeted once tonight. You're too valuable to risk further." "I'm the only one who's built a connection with these guys," Jamal argued. "They won't trust anyone else. If I don't show up for the next meeting, they'll know something's off." White hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, he sighed. "We'll discuss it with the team. But if you go back out there, you'll be under constant surveillance. No exceptions." Jamal nodded, his determination unwavering. "Deal." The safe house fell quiet as the night stretched on. Jamal lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the evening. The close call, the gunshots, the chase. It all felt surreal. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. The mission wasn't over, and the stakes were higher than ever. As dawn began to break, Jamal's phone buzzed on the table. He grabbed it, his pulse quickening as he saw the message. "Emergency meeting tonight. Be there. No excuses." Jamal's stomach tightened. The next chapter of this dangerous game had just begun. Jamal stared at the message for a long moment, his instincts on high alert. The words felt more like a threat than an invitation. He knew the stakes had shifted, the group's suspicions were growing, and his cover was hanging by a thread. As the safe house hummed with quiet activity, Agent White and Agent Collins joined him at the table. White glanced at the phone in Jamal's hand. "What's it say?" "Emergency meeting tonight. No excuses," Jamal replied, passing the phone to White. Collins frowned. "That doesn't sound like standard protocol for them. They're onto something. Or onto me," Jamal said, his voice grim. White set the phone down. "This could be a trap. They might be trying to flush you out." Jamal nodded, his jaw tightening. "If I don't show up, it's confirmation for them. If I do, I could be walking into an ambush." Collins leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Then we have to plan for both. We need to rig you with the best tech we've got. Full surveillance, backup teams nearby, and an extraction plan ready to go." White nodded in agreement. "We'll need eyes in the room. If they make a move, we'll hit them hard and fast. But, Jamal, you need to tread carefully. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the entire operation." "I understand," Jamal said, his voice steady. That evening, Jamal found himself driving toward the meeting location, a secluded warehouse on the edge of town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the industrial district. His car was equipped with an emergency beacon, a hidden tracker, and a camera embedded in the rearview mirror. The wire behind his ear had been upgraded to include a GPS signal. Agent White's voice came through the earpiece. "We're in position. Collins is in the surveillance van half a block away, and 2 teams are ready to move in if things go south. Copy that, Jamal said. As he pulled up to the warehouse, he noticed something unusual, fewer cars than he expected. Normally, these meetings were well attended, with at least a dozen operatives present. Tonight, there were only 3 vehicles parked near the entrance. That's odd, Collins murmured over the comms. Jamal stepped out of his car, his senses on high alert. The warehouse loomed in front of him, its windows dark and uninviting. He took a deep breath and approached the door, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. A single table sat in the center of the space, surrounded by a handful of men, including the leader with the piercing blue eyes. Jamal, the leader said, his voice cold. You're late. Traffic, Jamal replied smoothly, taking a seat at the table. The leader's eyes bore into them. You know why we called this meeting? Jamal shook his head. Figured it had to be important. It is, the leader said, leaning forward. We've got a problem. Someone's been leaking information and we're cleaning house. Jamal kept his face neutral, though his mind was racing. What do you need from me? The leader smirked, his expression predatory. Loyalty, and a little demonstration. He nodded to one of his men, who disappeared into a back room. Moments later, the man returned, dragging a young woman with her hands tied behind her back. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. This, the leader said, gesturing to the woman, is the rat. Or at least, that's what we're told. You're going to prove your loyalty by dealing with her. Jamal's stomach dropped, but he kept his composure. You want me to kill her? The leader leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with malice. That's right. Show us where your loyalties lie. In the surveillance stand, Agent Collins's voice came through Jamal's earpiece. We can't let him do this. White, we need to move now. Negative, White replied. He has to handle this himself. If we move in, we blow the operation. Jamal stared at the young woman, his mind racing. Every second felt like an eternity as he weighed his options. He couldn't kill an innocent person, but if he refused, his cover would be blown and the entire mission would collapse. He took a slow step forward, his hand brushing against the small knife on the table. The woman's eyes locked onto his, silently pleading for mercy. Jamal picked up the knife, the cool metal pressing against his palm. He turned back to the leader, his expression unreadable. If you're sure she's the rat, I'll do it. The leader's smirk widened. Good. Let's see what you're made of. Jamal approached the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised the knife, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. As the blade hovered near her neck, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to catch her eyes. Trust me, he mouthed silently. In one swift motion, Jamal spun around, launching the knife into the shoulder of the nearest guard. The man cried out, stumbling backward as blood seeped through his shirt. The room erupted into chaos. Jamal lunged for the leader, tackling him to the ground as the other men scrambled for their weapons. A gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. Move in. Agent White's voice roared over the comms. The warehouse doors burst open as FBI agents stormed in, their guns drawn. The suspects froze, their hands raised as the agents shouted commands. Jamal pinned the leader to the ground, twisting his arm behind his back. It's over, he growled. The leader sneered up at him. You're going to regret this. Not as much as you will, Jamal replied. As the suspects were cuffed and led away, Jamal sat on the edge of the table, catching his breath. The young woman was being tended to by an agent, her hands freed and her face pale but grateful. Agent White approached Jamal, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Hell of a gamble you took in there. Jamal managed a faint smile. Sometimes you've got to improvise. White nodded, his expression serious. We got enough evidence to shut this operation down for good. You did good, Jamal. Jamal exhaled deeply, the weight of the night finally settling on his shoulders. It's not over yet. There are still victims out there. And we'll find them, White assured him. Thanks to you. As the team packed up and prepared to leave, Jamal glanced back at the warehouse, its dark interior now empty and silent. The mission was a success, but the fight wasn't over. He climbed into the surveillance van, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Jamal sat in the FBI headquarters debriefing room, exhaustion evident in the circles under his eyes. The tension of the previous night lingered, like the smell of smoke after a fire. Around him, agents pored over evidence collected from the warehouse raid, files, laptops, and burner phones. Agent White entered the room, his face unreadable. He placed a file on the table in front of Jamal. "Take a look." Jamal opened it to find photos of a shipping container with the logo of a global freight company. A map marked its departure point in Mexico and its destination at a small port in Louisiana. "This is the shipment they mentioned." White nodded. "We intercepted some of their communications. They're moving their next batch of victims in less than 48 hours. We've already alerted the Coast Guard and local law enforcement, but there's one problem." Jamal leaned forward. "What's that?" "They're inside contact," White said grimly. "Someone on the port security team is working with the traffickers. We need you to identify them." Jamal's stomach sank. "You want me to go back under?" White nodded. "You're the only one who's been close enough to these people. If we don't identify the mole, the shipment could slip through, and those victims will disappear." Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight of the task pressing on him. "All right, what's the plan?" That evening, Jamal arrived at the port disguised as a dock worker. He wore a reflective vest, steel-toed boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The FBI had secured him a temporary ID badge to blend in, and a small earpiece connected him to Agent Collins, who was stationed in a surveillance van nearby. The port was a maze of shipping containers, cranes, and forklifts. Workers moved with purpose, loading and unloading cargo under the harsh glare of floodlights. Jamal blended in seamlessly, pushing a dolly loaded with crates as he scanned the area. "Anything yet?" Collins's voice crackled in his ear. "Not yet," Jamal murmured. "I'm looking for anything out of place." As he moved toward the far end of the port, he spotted a group of men huddled near a container. They were speaking in low voices, their body language tense. One of them glanced around nervously before unlocking the container and sliding the door open. Jamal angled himself to get a better view. Inside the container, he saw rows of metal cages. His stomach turned. "Collins, I've got eyes on something," he whispered. "What is it?" "A container. Looks like they're holding people inside." There was a pause. Then Collins's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "We need confirmation before we move in. Can you get closer?" Jamal hesitated. The men near the container were armed, and he was dangerously close to blowing his cover. But he knew they couldn't risk letting the shipment leave. "Give me a minute," he said. Jamal casually approached the group, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. He stopped a few feet away, pretending to inspect a nearby stack of crates. One of the men, a burly figure with a shaved head, noticed him and called out, "Kay, what are you doing over there?" Jamal turned, feigning indifference. "Supervisor sent me to check on container security. Said we had some complaints about doors not locking properly." The man narrowed his eyes. "Which supervisor?" "Martinez," Jamal replied, throwing out a common name he'd overheard earlier. The man exchanged a glance with one of his companions, then nodded. "Make it quick." Jamal approached the container, his heart pounding. He glanced inside, confirming what he'd already seen. Frightened faces peered out from behind the bars, their expressions a mixture of fear and desperation. He pressed a small button on his earpiece, signaling Collins. "Confirmed. Victims are inside." "Copy that," Collins replied. "Stand by. We're moving in." Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Who the hell is this guy?" Jamal turned to see a tall man in a security uniform striding toward him, his expression livid. The burly man stepped forward. "Says Martinez sent him to check on the locks." The security officer scoffed. "Martinez didn't send anyone. This guy's lying." Jamal's pulse quickened. He raised his hands, trying to de-escalate. "Hey, I'm just doing what I was told." The officer's eyes narrowed, and his hand drifted toward his gun. "I don't think so. Who are you really?" Before Jamal could respond, the floodlights above them suddenly cut out, plunging the area into darkness. A cacophony of shouts erupted as FBI agents stormed the port, their voices ringing out over the chaos. "Federal agents, get on the ground." The traffickers scrambled, some reaching for their weapons, others bolting into the maze of containers. Jamal ducked behind a crate as gunfire broke out, bullets ricocheting off the metal walls around him. "Collins, I'm pinned down," he shouted into the earpiece. "Hold tight," she replied. "Backup is closing in." Jamal peeked out, spotting the security officer, the suspected mole, running toward a nearby truck. He made a split-second decision, breaking cover and sprinting after him. The chase was a blur of adrenaline. Jamal darted between containers, his boots pounding against the asphalt as the officer weaved through the maze. "Stop!" Jamal shouted. The officer glanced back, his face twisted with panic. He pulled a pistol from his waistband, firing wildly over his shoulder. Jamal dropped to the ground, the bullets whizzing over his head. He reached for his own weapon, a compact handgun concealed beneath his vest, and fired a single shot, hitting the officer in the leg. The man cried out, collapsing to the ground. Jamal was on him in seconds, kicking the gun out of his reach and pinning him down. "Who are you working for?" Jamal demanded. The officer glared up at him, blood seeping through his pant leg. "You're too late. They'll replace me. They'll always replace me." Jamal tightened his grip. Not this time. By the time the chaos subsided, the FBI had rounded up the traffickers and freed the victims from the container. Jamal stood near the edge of the port, watching as paramedics attended to the survivors. Agent White approached him, his expression a mixture of pride and relief. "We got them," he said. "And thanks to you, we've got the mole too." Jamal nodded, though the weight of the night still pressed heavily on him. "What about the victims?" "They'll get the help they need," White assured him. As Jamal watched the survivors being led to safety, a small sense of satisfaction began to creep in. The fight wasn't over, but tonight, they had won a battle. The next morning, Jamal sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The events of the previous night played in his mind like a broken record. The gunfire, the terrified faces of the victims, the look of defiance on the mole's face. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Agent White. "Debrief at HQ. 10 a.m. Important updates." Jamal sighed and grabbed his jacket. It was time to face the next stage of the operation. At headquarters, the room was buzzing with activity. Agents huddled around computers and whiteboards, dissecting the evidence from the raid. Jamal spotted Agent Collins near the back. Her face lit up with a rare smile as she waved him over. "You made it out in one piece," she said. "Barely," Jamal replied with a small grin. "What's the update?" "White's about to brief everyone," she said, nodding toward the conference room. Jamal followed her inside, where White stood at the front of the room. A large map of the Gulf Coast was projected on the wall behind him, marked with red and blue pins. "Good to see you, Jamal," White said as he entered. "Take a seat." Once everyone was settled, White began. "Last night's operation was a major success. We dismantled a key hub of the trafficking network and rescued 27 victims. Thanks to Jamal's quick thinking, we also identified their mole at the port." There was a round of murmurs and nods. "But," White continued, his tone serious, "the fight isn't over. The documents we recovered indicate that the operation is much larger than we thought. This group is part of an international syndicate with connections in Central America, Europe, and beyond." He pointed to the map. "We've identified 2 major targets, a warehouse in Houston and a shipping facility in Miami. These locations are critical for their operations, and we need to take them down." Jamal raised his hand. "What's the timeline?" Houston is our priority, White replied. Intel suggests they're preparing another shipment in 3 days. Miami will follow. Collins leaned over to Jamal. Looks like you're not getting a break anytime soon. Jamal smirked. Wouldn't expect one. 3 days later, Jamal found himself in Houston, standing outside a sprawling industrial complex. The warehouse was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and security cameras dotted the perimeter. Agent Collins's voice crackled in his earpiece. You're good to go, Jamal. Cameras are looped, and the guards won't know you're there. Jamal adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, which contained surveillance equipment and a small arsenal of tools. He climbed over the fence and dropped silently onto the other side. The warehouse loomed ahead, its towering walls painted a dull gray. Jamal approached cautiously, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Rows of crates lined the space, their contents unknown. Jamal placed a small camera on one of the beams, ensuring it had a clear view of the area. Camera is live, he whispered. Copy that, Collins replied. We're seeing the feed. Jamal moved deeper into the warehouse, his footsteps barely making a sound on the concrete floor. As he rounded a corner, he froze. 2 men were standing near a stack of crates, talking in hushed tones. One of them held a clipboard, while the other gestured toward a container. Shipment's leaving tonight, one of them said. Jamal's heart raced. This was the intel they needed. He crouched behind a stack of crates, pulling out a small directional microphone to capture the conversation. Boss wants everything ready by 8 p.m., the man continued. No screw-ups this time. Jamal whispered into his mic. They're moving tonight, 8 p.m. Understood, White's voice replied. Stay on them. Jamal kept recording as the men moved further into the warehouse. He followed at a safe distance, careful to stay out of sight. As the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m., the warehouse grew busier. More workers arrived, moving crates and loading them onto trucks. Jamal watched from the shadows, noting every detail. Jamal, Collins's voice came through. Backup is in position. We're moving in 5 minutes. Copy that, Jamal replied. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jamal spun around, his fist flying on instinct. It connected with the jaw of a burly guard who staggered back but didn't go down. Over here, the guard shouted. Jamal's cover was blown. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Workers scattered as armed guards poured in, their weapons drawn. Jamal dove behind a stack of crates as bullets whizzed past him, splintering the wooden boxes. White, I'm made, he shouted into the mic. We're moving in now, White replied. The warehouse doors burst open as FBI agents stormed in, their voices echoing through the cavernous space. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Jamal took advantage of the distraction, grabbing a nearby metal rod and using it to knock out a guard who had gotten too close. He grabbed the man's gun and returned fire, keeping the other guards pinned down. Amid the chaos, he spotted the man with the clipboard running toward the back exit. White, target's making a run for it, Jamal called out. Stay on him, White replied. Jamal sprinted after the man, dodging crates and gunfire. As he reached the back exit, he saw the man climbing into a truck, its engine roaring to life. Jamal didn't hesitate. He leaped onto the truck's side, gripping the door handle as the vehicle sped off into the night. The truck barreled down a deserted road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jamal clung to the side, his muscles straining as the wind whipped past him. Inside the cab, the driver glanced over and cursed, swerving wildly in an attempt to shake Jamal off. Jamal gritted his teeth and swung himself onto the roof, his fingers gripping the edges tightly. The truck swerved again, nearly throwing him off balance. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small tracking device. With one hand, he slapped it onto the roof of the truck, ensuring the FBI would be able to follow. But before he could secure his position, the driver slammed on the brakes. Jamal was thrown forward, landing hard on the pavement. The truck sped away, leaving Jamal sprawled on the road, his vision swimming. In his earpiece, White's voice crackled through. "Jamal, are you okay?" Jamal groaned, struggling to his feet. "I'm fine, but the truck's getting away." "Not for long," White replied. "We've got the tracker. Stay put. We're sending a team to pick you up." As Jamal stood there in the darkness, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, he knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over yet. Jamal leaned against a street lamp, catching his breath as the sound of distant sirens grew louder. His body ached from the rough landing, but his mind was focused on one thing: the truck. It carried vital evidence, and if it disappeared, their entire operation could fall apart. Moments later, an unmarked black SUV screeched to a halt beside him. Agent Collins jumped out, her face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" "Nothing I can't handle," Jamal replied, wincing slightly as he straightened. "What's the status on the truck?" Collins gestured for him to get in as Agent White's voice came through the SUV's comm system. "Tracker's active. They're heading west on Route 14. We've got teams in pursuit." Jamal climbed into the passenger seat, fastening his seatbelt. "Let's go." The SUV roared onto the highway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Collins expertly navigated the traffic, keeping her eyes on the GPS tracking the stolen truck. Jamal stayed silent, his thoughts racing as he replayed the events at the warehouse. "How many men do you think they had in that truck?" Collins asked, breaking the silence. "At least two," Jamal replied. "Driver and the guy with the clipboard. Maybe more in the back." "Armed?" "Definitely," Jamal said grimly. Collins nodded, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We'll need to be smart about this. If they're desperate enough, they could use the cargo as leverage." 10 minutes later, the tracker led them to a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense forest. The faint glow of taillights appeared in the distance. "There," Jamal said, pointing. Collins eased off the accelerator, keeping a safe distance. "Backup is closing in. ETA 3 minutes." Jamal reached for his earpiece. "White, we've got eyes on the truck. They're heading west on Forest Road 8. "Copy that," White replied. "Hold position until backup arrives." But before they could react, the truck veered sharply off the road, crashing through a chain-link gate and disappearing into the woods. "They're going off-road," Jamal shouted. Collins cursed under her breath, slamming the SUV into a lower gear. "We can't wait for backup. Hang on." The SUV jolted and bounced as it tore through the uneven terrain, branches scraping against the windows. The truck loomed ahead, its taillights glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. "They're heading toward the river," Jamal said, his voice tense. Collins nodded. "If they make it to the water, we'll lose them." Jamal's mind raced. "Get me close enough, and I'll jump in." "Are you insane?" Collins shot back. "Trust me," Jamal said, his tone firm. Collins hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "You've got one shot. Don't miss." She accelerated, closing the gap between the SUV and the truck. Jamal unbuckled his seatbelt and climbed onto the doorframe, gripping the roof for support. "Ready," Collins called out. "Go," Jamal shouted. With a sudden burst of speed, Collins pulled the SUV alongside the truck. Jamal leaped, his fingers catching the edge of the truck's bed. He hauled himself up, narrowly avoiding a low-hanging branch as the truck barreled through the forest. Jamal crouched in the truck's bed, his heart pounding. The sound of the roaring engine and snapping branches filled his ears. He glanced around, spotting the crates from the warehouse strapped down with heavy ropes. "White, I'm on the truck," he whispered into his earpiece. "Good. Stay low." "We're closing in," White replied. Jamal moved carefully, inching toward the cab. He could see the driver and the man with the clipboard through the rear window. They were shouting at each other, their panic evident. Before Jamal could make his next move, the man with the clipboard turned and spotted him. His eyes widened in shock, and he reached for a weapon. Jamal reacted instinctively, grabbing a crowbar from the bed and smashing it against the rear window. The glass shattered, and the man shouted in surprise, fumbling with his pistol. Jamal climbed into the cab, wrestling the weapon from the man's hands. The driver swerved wildly, trying to throw Jamal off balance. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Jamal landed a solid punch to the clipboard man's jaw, knocking him out cold. He turned his attention to the driver, who was struggling to maintain control of the truck. "Stop the truck," Jamal shouted. The driver snarled, reaching for a knife on the dashboard. Jamal lunged forward, grabbing the wheel and yanking it hard to the left. The truck skidded, crashing through a thicket of trees before coming to a screeching halt at the edge of a steep ravine. Jamal tumbled out of the cab, his body aching from the impact. The driver staggered out as well, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. "You should have stayed out of this," the driver growled. Jamal raised his fists, his breath coming in short gasps. "You're not getting away." The driver lunged, slashing wildly. Jamal dodged, countering with a quick jab to the man's ribs. The knife clattered to the ground as the driver fell to his knees, groaning in pain. Moments later, the sound of engines and flashing lights filled the forest as the FBI team arrived. Agents swarmed the scene, securing the truck and taking the driver into custody. White approached Jamal, a look of admiration on his face. "Hell of a job, Evans." Jamal nodded, his exhaustion catching up with him. "Did we get everything?" "We did," White confirmed. "Crates are intact, and the evidence will tie this network to their international counterparts." Jamal leaned against a tree, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "Good. Let's bring them all down." As the operation wrapped up, Jamal watched the truck being towed away under heavy guard. The night had been long and brutal, but they had scored another victory against the traffickers. But Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere out there, more lives were at stake, and he wasn't about to stop until every last victim was free. The FBI headquarters buzzed with activity as the team sifted through the evidence recovered from the truck. The crates had yielded a treasure trove of information: encrypted ledgers, fake passports, and detailed shipping manifests. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the trafficking syndicate's sprawling operation. Jamal sat at a workstation, flipping through photos of the recovered documents. Agent Collins handed him a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You look like you could use this," she said. "Thanks," Jamal replied, taking a sip. "What's the latest?" Collins gestured to the screen in front of her. "The manifests list drop-off points across the Gulf Coast, but here's the kicker. One of them matches an address tied to a high-ranking politician." Jamal's eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding." "Nope," Collins said, pulling up the details. "Senator Grant. His campaign headquarters is listed as a recipient for one of the shipments. It's buried under a shell company, but the connection is there." Jamal leaned back, his mind racing. "If he's involved, this goes deeper than we thought. We're not just dealing with criminals. We're dealing with powerful people protecting them." Later that day, Jamal and the team gathered in the conference room for a briefing. Agent White stood at the head of the table, a grim expression on his face. "We've uncovered evidence linking the syndicate to Senator Grant," White began. "If the connection holds, it could explain why this network has operated under the radar for so long. We suspect Grant is using his influence to shield them." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. "This changes the game," White continued. "We can't just take down the traffickers. We have to expose the people enabling them. That means playing this smart and by the book. No slip-ups." Jamal raised his hand. "What's our next move?" White pointed to a map on the screen. "There's a fundraiser at Grant's estate in 2 days. It's the perfect opportunity to gather intel and possibly confront him. Jamal, you'll be going in undercover." The plan was straightforward but risky. Jamal would pose as a tech consultant hired by one of the event's sponsors, giving him access to the estate and its secure areas. Meanwhile, Collins and a surveillance team would monitor from a nearby van, ready to step in if things went sideways. 2 days later, Jamal stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tailored suit. The polished look was a far cry from his usual undercover personas, but it fit the upscale setting of the event. You clean up nice, Collins said, grinning as she handed him a lapel pin. Jamal examined it closely. Tracker. Camera and mic, she corrected. We'll be able to see and hear everything you do. Just don't sneeze too loud. Jamal smirked. Got it. The fundraiser was in full swing by the time Jamal arrived. The senator's estate was a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and a private security detail. Luxury cars lined the driveway, and waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved gracefully through the crowd. Jamal entered the grand foyer, blending seamlessly with the well-dressed guests. He spotted Senator Grant almost immediately, a tall, silver-haired man with a commanding presence. Target in sight, Jamal whispered into the mic. Copy that, Collins replied. Keep your distance for now. We need to identify his key contacts. Jamal mingled with the crowd, making small talk and subtly observing the senator. He noticed a group of men and women gathered near a bar, their conversation hushed but intense. Collins, I think I found his inner circle, Jamal murmured. Can you get closer? Working on it, he replied. Jamal approached the group, pretending to inspect the hors d'oeuvres on a nearby table. He angled his lapel pin toward the group, capturing their conversation. We can't afford any more mistakes, one of the men was saying. The last shipment was merely compromised. Relax, another replied. Grant has everything under control. As long as we stick to the plan, we're untouchable. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He moved away, pretending to take a phone call. Did you hear that? He whispered into the mic. Every word, Collins replied. Keep gathering intel. We need concrete evidence. The night wore on and Jamal continued to gather snippets of conversation, each one painting a clearer picture of the syndicate's operations. But his luck ran out when one of Grant's security guards approached him. Sir, may I have a word? The guard asked, his tone polite but firm. Jamal nodded, his heart pounding. Of course. The guard led him to a side room, away from the crowd. Once inside, his demeanor changed. You're not on the guest list, the guard said, his eyes narrowing. Jamal kept his composure. On a last-minute addition. Tech consultant for Mr. Holden. The guard's expression remained suspicious. Holden didn't mention bringing anyone. Mind if I check with him? Jamal's mind raced. If the guard called Holden, his cover would be blown. That won't be necessary, Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. If you have a problem, we can take it up with the senator directly. I'm sure he'd love to know his guests are being interrogated. The guard hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. Enjoy the party. Jamal left the room, his heart still racing. Back in the surveillance van, Collins's voice came through. That was close. You okay? Yeah, Jamal replied. But I think it's time to wrap this up. We've got enough to connect Grant to the network. Agreed, White said. We'll move in tomorrow with a warrant. Could work, Jamal. As Jamal drove away from the estate, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were just the tip of the iceberg. The fight against the syndicate was far from over, but they had taken a crucial step forward. And Jamal was ready for whatever came next. The following morning, Jamal arrived at FBI headquarters to find the team already in action. A warrant had been issued for Senator Grant's estate, and the operation to apprehend him was set to begin within hours. Jamal joined Agent White and Agent Collins in the war room, where a detailed blueprint of the senator's mansion was displayed on a screen. White gestured to the map. We're hitting the estate from 3 entry points: front gate, rear garden, and the service entrance. Jamal, you're with Collins and Bravo team. Your objective is to secure the senator and retrieve any devices or documents from his office. Jamal nodded, the tension in the room palpable. What's the risk assessment? White sighed. High. Grant's private security is heavily armed, and there's a good chance he'll try to destroy evidence before we reach him. We can't let that happen. Collins patted Jamal on the back. No pressure, right? An hour later, the FBI convoy rolled up to the gated entrance of the estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its polished facade hiding the dark secrets within. Jamal adjusted his bulletproof vest as he stepped out of the vehicle, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Bravo team, move into position," Collins instructed through her radio. Jamal followed the team toward the side entrance, his weapon drawn. They moved with precision, their training evident in every step. "On my count," Collins whispered. 3, 2, 1. A battering ram smashed through the door, and the team surged inside, clearing the rooms one by one. Inside the mansion, chaos erupted. Security guards scrambled to defend the estate, but they were no match for the FBI's tactical units. Gunfire echoed through the hallways as the agents pushed forward, their goal clear. Jamal and Collins led their team toward the senator's office on the second floor. As they approached, they heard frantic voices coming from inside. "Destroy everything," someone shouted. Jamal didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open, his weapon sweeping the room. Inside, Senator Grant stood behind his desk, flanked by two men frantically smashing laptops and shredding documents. "Hands in the air," Jamal commanded. Grant's face twisted in anger. "You've got no right to be here." "Actually, we do," Collins said, stepping forward and holding up the warrant. "You're under arrest, Senator Grant." One of the men lunged for a weapon, but Jamal fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Don't even think about it." The men froze, raising their hands as agents swarmed the room, securing the senator and his associates. As the scene calmed, Jamal turned his attention to the desk. A locked drawer caught his eye, and he pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, he found a ledger filled with names, dates, and amounts of money, undeniable evidence of the trafficking operation's financial backers. "Collins, take a look at this," Jamal said, handing her the ledger. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "This is it. This ties Grant directly to the syndicate." Jamal nodded, satisfaction flickering in his chest. "Let's get it to evidence." As the team secured the mansion and transported Grant into custody, the reality of their success began to sink in. They had struck a major blow against the syndicate, taking down one of its most powerful protectors. But Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. Later that evening, Jamal sat in a quiet corner of the FBI headquarters, reviewing the ledger. The names listed weren't just criminals. They were influential figures in politics, business, and law enforcement. Collins approached, a cup of coffee in her hand. "You've been at this all day. Take a break." Jamal shook his head. "This ledger could unravel the entire operation. We can't stop now." Collins sighed but didn't push further. "You did good today, Jamal. Really good." He gave her a small smile. "Thanks, but until every victim is free, it's not enough." As night fell, Jamal finally left the office, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. The senator's arrest had been a major victory, but the ledger hinted at an even larger conspiracy. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous players were still out there, watching, waiting. The arrest of Senator Grant sent shockwaves through the media the following day. News outlets broadcast images of the senator being led away in handcuffs, his face a mix of defiance and fear. Headlines screamed of corruption, human trafficking, and the FBI's breakthrough operation. At headquarters, the team gathered around a bank of monitors watching the coverage unfold. Agent White turned to the group. "Enjoy the moment, but don't lose focus. This is just the beginning. The ledger ties Grant to several high-ranking individuals, and they'll be on high alert now. We need to move quickly before they have a chance to cover their tracks." Jamal nodded. "What's our next step?" White pulled up a map on the screen. "One of the names in the ledger is tied to a property in Miami. We believe it's a staging ground for the next shipment. You'll be leading the infiltration team." Jamal leaned forward. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," White said. "We can't risk losing the element of surprise." By midnight, Jamal and his team were on a plane to Miami. The briefing on the way was intense. The property, a secluded warehouse near the port, was heavily guarded. Surveillance suggested the shipment would be leaving at dawn. Collins sat beside Jamal, reviewing blueprints of the warehouse. This place is a fortress, she said. Armed guards, security cameras, and only 2 points of entry. It's going to be tricky. Jamal studied the plans. We'll split into 2 teams. One will create a diversion at the main gate, while the other infiltrates through the side entrance. Once inside, we secure the shipment and take down anyone involved. Sounds solid, Collins said. Let's hope it goes as planned. The operation began under the cover of darkness. Jamal led the infiltration team, his nerves steady as they approached the warehouse. The diversion team created chaos at the main gate, drawing the guards' attention and leaving the side entrance lightly defended. Jamal motioned for his team to move in, their footsteps silent on the gravel. They breached the side door and entered a cavernous space filled with crates and shipping containers. Collins were inside. Jamal whispered into his mic. Copy that, she replied. Diversion team is holding steady. Proceed with caution. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, the scale of the operation became clear. Crates labeled with false manifests were stacked high, and the faint sound of muffled cries came from one of the containers. Jamal's stomach churned. We found the victims, he said, requesting medical support and extraction. On the way, White's voice came through. Jamal and his team approached the container, carefully prying it open. Inside were over a dozen people, men, women, and children, huddled together, their faces pale and frightened. It's okay, Jamal said gently. We're here to help. The team began guiding the victims out when a shout echoed through the warehouse. They're here. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing off the walls. Jamal dove behind a stack of crates, returning fire as the guards closed in. Collins, we're under attack, he shouted. Backup is 2 minutes out, she replied. The firefight was intense, the guards using the warehouse's layout to their advantage. Jamal's team held their ground, covering the victims as they were escorted to safety. In the chaos, Jamal spotted a man near the back of the warehouse, frantically packing a briefcase. He recognized him from the ledger, a mid-level operative in the syndicate. I've got eyes on one of the targets, Jamal said, breaking cover and sprinting toward the man. The operative saw him coming and bolted, weaving through the maze of crates. Jamal gave chase, his pulse pounding as he closed the distance. The man reached a metal staircase leading to the upper level. Jamal followed, his footsteps echoing loudly. At the top, the operative turned, swinging a crowbar at Jamal. Jamal ducked, the weapon missing his head by inches. He countered with a quick jab to the man's gut, sending him stumbling back. You're not getting away, Jamal said, grabbing the briefcase. The operative sneered. You think taking me down will stop this? You're in over your head. Maybe, Jamal replied, cuffing the man's hands, but I'm taking you down anyway. By the time backup arrived, the firefight had subsided. The remaining guards were subdued, and the victims were being treated by medics. Jamal handed the briefcase to Collins, who opened it to reveal stacks of documents and a laptop. This could be the key to dismantling the entire network, she said. Jamal nodded, exhaustion etched on his face. Let's hope so. Back at headquarters, the mood was somber but determined. The documents in the briefcase provided crucial intel on the syndicate's operations, including their leadership structure and international connections. White addressed the team. We've dealt a major blow tonight, but the fight isn't over. The higher-ups in this network won't go down without a fight. Jamal sat in the corner, his mind already racing with strategies for the next mission. The battle was far from over, but for the first time he felt like they were getting closer to shutting the syndicate down for good. The FBI headquarters was alive with activity as the documents from the briefcase were analyzed. A map of the syndicate's operations was beginning to take shape, with nodes spanning across the United States and extending into Central America and Europe. One name stood out among the rest: Victor Moreau, the syndicate's elusive leader. Agent White called a meeting in the war room. We've confirmed that Victor Moreau is the mastermind behind this network. The documents we recovered detailed his involvement in planning shipments, laundering money, and leveraging corrupt officials like Senator Grant to protect his operations. The room buzzed with murmurs. Moreau was a shadowy figure, known for evading law enforcement for years. White pointed to the screen, which displayed an image of a private island in the Caribbean. Moreau is hosting a summit for his top lieutenants here in 48 hours. This is our chance to take him down and dismantle the syndicate for good. Jamal raised a hand. How do we get there without tipping him off? Collins chimed in. We've secured invitations for 2 undercover agents. Jamal, you're going in as a wealthy businessman who wants to invest in Moreau's operations. I'll be posing as your associate. The rest of the team will provide backup from a nearby vessel. White nodded. This is a high-risk mission. If anything goes wrong, we may not get another shot at Moreau. Jamal leaned back, his mind already racing with plans. Let's make sure it doesn't go wrong. 2 days later, Jamal and Collins boarded a sleek speedboat disguised as a private transport vessel. They were dressed to blend in with the wealthy and influential crowd that Moreau surrounded himself with. The island came into view, its pristine beaches and luxurious villas belying the dark dealings happening behind closed doors. Security was tight, with armed guards patrolling the docks and scanning every guest upon arrival. Jamal handed over his forged credentials, keeping his expression calm as the guard scrutinized them. After a tense moment, the guard nodded and waved them through. "Welcome to the island, Mr. Parker," the guard said, using Jamal's alias. Jamal inclined his head. "Thank you. I look forward to the summit." Inside the main villa, the atmosphere was opulent but tense. Moreau's lieutenants mingled, their sharp eyes assessing every newcomer. Jamal and Collins stuck to the edges of the crowd, observing and quietly gathering intel. "See that guy near the bar?" Collins whispered. "That's Carlos Vega, one of Moreau's top enforcers. He's been running operations in Central America." Jamal nodded. "I'll see if I can get him talking. Keep an eye on the room." He approached Vega, a confident smile on his face. "Carlos Vega, right? I've heard a lot about you." Vega raised an eyebrow, his stance guarded. "And you are?" "Parker. James Parker. I'm new to the operation, but I've been impressed with the scale of your work." Vega smirked, his suspicion giving way to arrogance. "It's a well-oiled machine. Moreau doesn't tolerate mistakes." Jamal nodded, steering the conversation toward details of the syndicate's operations. Vega, eager to show off, began dropping hints about their shipping routes and laundering schemes. Collins's voice came through Jamal's earpiece. "Good work. Keep him talking." The summit began in a private conference room, with Moreau seated at the head of a long table. He was a charismatic man in his 60s, his silver hair and tailored suit giving him the appearance of a legitimate businessman. Jamal and Collins took their seats among the attendees, their identities carefully maintained. Moreau outlined plans for expanding the syndicate's operations, his tone calm and authoritative. "We are at a turning point," Moreau said. "Law enforcement is closing in, but they don't understand our reach. With the right investments, we can ensure that our network remains untouchable." Jamal clenched his fists under the table, keeping his expression neutral. The arrogance of the man was infuriating. As the summit concluded, Moreau invited a select few to a private dinner. To Jamal's surprise, he and Collins were among those chosen. "Looks like we're making an impression," Collins whispered. "Let's hope it's the right kind," Jamal replied. The dinner was held in a lavish dining room overlooking the ocean. Moreau sat at the head of the table, his lieutenants flanking him. Jamal and Collins were seated near the middle, their presence barely acknowledged by the others. As the meal progressed, Jamal noticed Moreau subtly signaling one of his guards. Moments later, the guard approached Jamal and leaned down. "Mr. Parker, the boss would like a word with you in private," the guard said. Jamal exchanged a quick glance with Collins, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. "Of course," Jamal said, rising from his seat. Moreau led Jamal to a study filled with antique furniture and bookshelves. He poured himself a glass of scotch and gestured for Jamal to sit. "I make it a point to know everyone who gets involved in my business," Moreau said, his tone casual but sharp. "Tell me, Mr. Parker, Why should I trust you? Jamal leaned back, his expression calm. Because I'm here to make money, and I've heard you're the best in the business. I don't ask questions and I don't make mistakes. Morrell studied him for a long moment and smiled. I like your confidence, but trust is earned, not given. Let's see how you handle yourself in the coming days. Jamal nodded, forcing a smile. Looking forward to it. Back in the surveillance vessel, Agent White listened intently to the conversation through Jamal's mic. Did you catch all that? Collins whispered into her comms. Loud and clear, White replied. Morrow's testing him. We need to be ready for anything. As Jamal returned to the dining room, he felt the weight of Morrow's gaze following him. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jamal knew that any slip could cost him his life. And the mission. Jamal sat back at the dinner table, carefully masking the turmoil brewing inside him. Morrow's words in the study replayed in his mind. Trust is earned, not given. It was a warning and a challenge. Jamal had to tread carefully. Collins subtly leaned toward him, her voice barely audible. What did he say? He's testing me, Jamal murmured. Wants to see if I'm useful or expendable. The meal continued, the conversation flowing between guests as if no one noticed the undercurrent of tension. But Jamal could feel the sharp eyes of Morrow's lieutenants on him, scrutinizing his every move. As dessert was served, Morrow stood, raising his glass. Gentlemen and ladies, we have much to celebrate. Our network is stronger than ever, and with the right moves, it will remain so. To success. To success, the room echoed. Jamal clinked his glass with Collins's, his smile hiding the knot in his stomach. Later that evening, Jamal and Collins retreated to their assigned guest suite in one of the villas. As soon as the door closed, Jamal removed the lapel pin and placed it on the desk. Did we get everything? He asked, looking at the pin as if it could answer him. Collins nodded, pulling out a small laptop. Audio feed was clear. White and the team will analyze everything. What about you? Think he bought it? For now, Jamal replied, rubbing the back of his neck. But I have a feeling he's not done testing me yet. The next morning, a messenger delivered a handwritten note to their suite. It was from Morrell. Mr. Parker, I have an assignment for you. Meet me at the docks at noon. V. Morrell. Collins read the note over Jamal's shoulder. What do you think this is? Could be anything, Jamal said. But whatever it is, it's a trap or a loyalty test. Either way, I'm walking into it. Collins frowned. You don't have to do this alone. We could call in the team, end this now. Jamal shook his head. Not yet. If we move too soon, Morrell slips through our fingers. I'll play along for now. At noon, Jamal arrived at the docks, where Morrell was waiting with two of his lieutenants. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, and the heat of the Caribbean sun bore down relentlessly. Morrell smiled when he saw Jamal. Ah, Mr. Parker. Punctuality? I like that. Come, walk with me. Jamal fell into step beside Morrell, his instincts on high alert. The lieutenants followed a few paces behind, their expressions unreadable. Tell me, Mr. Parker, Morrell began, do you have any experience with hands-on logistics? Jamal nodded. I've handled my share of shipments. Good, Morrell said, leading him toward a large cargo ship docked nearby. Today, you'll oversee the loading of a very important delivery. I need someone I can trust to ensure there are no complications. Jamal's heart raced. This was it, the syndicate's next big operation. If he could confirm what they were transporting, it would give the FBI the leverage they needed to shut Morrow down for good. Consider it done, Jamal said smoothly. Morrow smiled. I knew I could count on you. The operation was meticulously coordinated. Workers moved quickly, loading crates onto the ship under Jamal's watchful eye. He noted the subtle signals exchanged between the workers and the armed guards, a reminder of the stakes. As he moved between the containers, Jamal caught sight of one crate left slightly ajar. Inside, he saw what he feared most: People. A young boy, no older than 10, peeked out, his wide eyes filled with fear. Jamal's stomach turned, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't blow his cover now. One of the lieutenants approached. "Everything going smoothly, Mr. Parker?" Jamal nodded, stepping in front of the crate to block the man's view. "No issues. We'll be done on schedule." "Good," the lieutenant said. "Moreau doesn't tolerate delays." As night fell, the loading was complete. Moreau returned to the docks, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "Well done, Mr. Parker," he said, clapping Jamal on the shoulder. "You've proven yourself today." Jamal forced a smile. "Glad to help." Moreau's phone buzzed, and he stepped aside to take the call. Jamal took the opportunity to speak quietly into his hidden mic. "White, I've confirmed it. They're trafficking people. The ship is leaving tonight." White's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Understood. We're mobilizing now. Do not engage until we're in position." Jamal's pulse quickened. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the most dangerous part was yet to come. As the ship prepared to depart, Moreau called Jamal over. "You've impressed me, Mr. Parker. Why don't you join me on the voyage? I'd like to discuss your future with us." Jamal's heart sank. If he boarded that ship, he'd be trapped, and the team might not be able to reach him in time. But refusing could arouse suspicion. "Of course," Jamal said, forcing another smile. "It would be an honor." The ship's engines roared to life as it pulled away from the dock, the lights of the island fading into the distance. Jamal stood on the deck, the vast ocean stretching out before him. In his earpiece, Collins's voice came through. "We're tracking you. Hang tight. Help is coming." Jamal gripped the railing, his mind racing. The FBI was closing in, but he was in the lion's den now, and one wrong move could cost him everything. The ship moved steadily through the dark waters, the faint hum of its engines blending with the sound of waves crashing against the hull. Jamal stood on the deck, his hands gripping the railing as he scanned the horizon. The FBI team was out there, tracking the vessel, but for now he was on his own. "Mr. Parker." Jamal turned to see Victor Moreau approaching, his polished demeanor as unnerving as ever. Moreau gestured toward a private cabin near the helm of the ship. "Join me for a drink," he said. Jamal followed, his instincts on high alert. Moreau led him into the cabin, a luxurious space filled with fine leather furniture and an impressive bar. The older man poured 2 glasses of scotch, handing one to Jamal. "To new partnerships," Moreau said, raising his glass. "To new partnerships," Jamal echoed, taking a sip. Moreau leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying Jamal. "You've handled yourself well, but trust is a fragile thing in our business. One crack and everything falls apart." Jamal kept his expression calm. "I understand. That's why I'm here, to prove my value." Moreau nodded, but his expression darkened. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Parker. Have you ever lied to someone who trusted you?" Jamal's pulse quickened. "Lying is part of the game sometimes," he said smoothly, "but I've never betrayed anyone who didn't deserve it." Moreau's lips curled into a thin smile. "A careful answer. I can respect that." Meanwhile, on a nearby FBI vessel, Agent White and Collins monitored Jamal's location via GPS. "He's in the lion's den," Collins muttered. "We need to move soon." White nodded. "The ship is heading toward an unregistered port. That's where they'll offload the victims. We'll intercept them there." Back on the ship, Moreau stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the ocean. "You've seen enough of our operation now to understand its scale. But what you haven't seen is its reach. We don't just transport goods. We influence governments, control markets, and decide who rises and falls." Jamal clenched his fists, keeping his face neutral. "That's impressive." Moreau turned, his gaze piercing. "It is, and it's why we can't afford loose ends. Which brings me to my next question. Why are you really here?" The air in the cabin grew heavy. Jamal's mind raced as he considered his response. "I'm here to make money," he said evenly, "and to work with the best." Moreau stared at him for a long moment and chuckled. I like you, Mr. Parker, but you're not as clever as you think. Before Jamal could react, 2 guards burst into the cabin, their guns drawn. Search him, Moreau ordered. The guards patted Jamal down, their hands rough and methodical. They found the small wire hidden in his watch band and ripped it free. Moreau held up the device, his smile fading. A listening device. You've been very busy, Mr. Parker. Jamal's cover was blown. The guards grabbed his arms, forcing him to his knees. Moreau crouched in front of him, his expression icy. Who do you work for? Jamal remained silent, his mind racing. I'll ask again, Moreau said, his voice dangerously low. Who do you work for? Jamal met his gaze, defiance in his eyes. You already know. Moreau stood, his jaw tightening. Take him below. We'll deal with him later. The guards dragged Jamal out of the cabin and down a narrow staircase, shoving him into a dimly lit storage room. They locked the door, leaving him alone in the oppressive silence. On the FBI vessel, Collins's voice crackled through the comms. We've lost the feed. Jamal's been made. White slammed his fist on the table. We're moving now. Everyone gear up. In the storage room, Jamal worked quickly, his hands fumbling with a lock on his handcuffs. He had memorized the layout of the ship during the loading operation, and he knew there was a chance to escape if he could time it right. After a tense minute, the lock clicked open. Jamal slipped out of the cuffs and scanned the room for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a heavy wrench, and he grabbed it, his resolve hardening. He crept to the door, listening for footsteps. When the guards returned, he was ready. The first guard stepped inside, and Jamal struck him across the head with the wrench, knocking him out cold. The second guard raised his weapon, but Jamal tackled him, disarming him with a swift twist. Jamal stood, his chest heaving. He couldn't afford to waste time. On the deck, Moreau was barking orders, oblivious to Jamal's escape. The ship's crew scrambled to prepare for their arrival at the unregistered port. Jamal climbed the stairs quietly, his stolen weapon in hand. He spotted Moreau near the helm, surrounded by his lieutenants. I need eyes on the FBI vessel, Moreau said. If they're close, we'll change course. Jamal stepped into the open, his weapon trained on Moreau. It's over, Moreau, he said. The lieutenants spun around, drawing their weapons, but Jamal fired a warning shot into the air. Drop your guns, he shouted. Before anyone could act, floodlights illuminated the ship as the FBI vessel pulled alongside. Federal agents. White's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Stand down and surrender. The deck erupted into chaos as FBI agents boarded the ship. Moreau's men tried to fight back, but they were quickly overpowered. Jamal tackled Moreau as he tried to flee, pinning him to the deck. It's over, Jamal said, cuffing him. Moreau glared up at him, his arrogance replaced by fury. You think this ends with me? You're a fool. Jamal leaned closer, his voice steady. We'll see about that. As dawn broke, the victims were freed, and Moreau was taken into custody. Jamal stood on the deck, watching as the FBI team secured the ship. Collins approached, a tired smile on her face. You did it. We did it, Jamal corrected, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. White joined them, nodding in approval. This is a major victory, Jamal. Moreau's network is finished. Jamal gazed out at the horizon, a sense of relief washing over him. The fight had been long and grueling, but justice had finally been served. The aftermath of the raid was a blur of activity. Victor Moreau and his lieutenants were taken into custody, and the victims were transported to safety, their ordeal finally over. The FBI team returned to headquarters, where a sense of triumph mixed with exhaustion filled the air. Jamal sat in the debriefing room surrounded by his team. Agent White stood at the head of the table, a rare smile on his face. Moreau is in federal custody, White began. The evidence we've gathered will ensure he never sees the light of day again. His network is in shambles, and international partners are working to dismantle the remaining operations overseas. This is a victory not just for us, but for every victim we've freed and every life we've saved. The room erupted into applause, but Jamal stayed quiet, his thoughts lingering on the faces of the victims. After the meeting, Collins found him in the hallway. "You okay?" Jamal nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking about the kids on that ship. It's over for morale, but there's still so much work to do." Collins smiled gently. "And we'll keep doing it. But for now, take a moment to let this sink in. You did something incredible, Jamal." In the days that followed, Jamal watched as the media covered Moreau's downfall. Headlines praised the FBI's operation, and stories of the rescue victims began to emerge. Families were reunited, and those without families were placed in safe environments with support to rebuild their lives. Jamal attended a small gathering where some of the survivors were present. A young boy who had been on the ship approached him, holding a handmade thank you card. "Are you the man who helped us?" the boy asked, his voice soft but steady. Jamal crouched down to meet his eyes. "I'm just part of a team that wanted to make sure you were safe." The boy handed him the card. "Thank you." Jamal accepted it, his chest tightening with emotion. "You're welcome. You're very brave, you know that?" The boy nodded, a small smile breaking through his shy demeanor before he returned to his family. Back at headquarters, Jamal packed up his desk. Agent White approached, a knowing look on his face. "You're taking time off?" White asked. Jamal nodded. "I think I've earned a little break." White smiled. "You've earned more than that. But don't get too comfortable. We'll need you back soon enough." Jamal laughed softly. "I'll be ready." That evening, Jamal stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter now. He had faced danger, exposed corruption, and brought justice to those who thought they were untouchable. But more importantly, he had made a difference. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jamal allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for now it was enough.